loose? You can move it out a little bit. Oh, this one here. I think I got it. All right. So the point fits in there. We'll bring this up and lock it good and tight. This side fits in. I find that if I grab the spindle with one hand and leave a thumb out here, then you just can't do much trying to do this. But if you put a thumb up against it here, you get a reference to it and bring it up slowly. And then tighten down on it. And then everybody wants to talk about how do you set the center in the drive center. And I generally just take the knockout rod and run it in there. And then come back over here and set this in. So end pressure on spindles, and particularly fairly long ones that are slim, becomes really an issue. If you have too much end pressure, well, then it wants to vibrate really badly. And so you have to set the tailstock center in, and you turn this thing on by, push off, pull on, and then you just turn the speed up here. Come and talk to me here, somebody. Forward. Look at you there. All right. So to set the tailstock, oh, I can't even do it here either. Usually there's a bigger tailstock section there. Anyway, I'm doing the best I can here. The concept here is that I tell people that if you take a yardstick, an old school yardstick, really nice straight one, you can probably push on it hard like this. But if you get your buddy to come up there and just do this with it, it'll spring right out of your hands. Same concept here. So is that how we turn this off? Just run the speed down? Or what? Okay. All right. So the fellow that gave me the spindle, the job here, said, I want you to expand this thing 2 inches on either end. And I'm going to get my handy pocket rule out of here. So we want to put this up here at 2 inches. And that should generate 2 inches down there. I just got a job for doing 48 spindles for a fellow. Not this job. But all you do here when you're laying out things here, the first thing you have to do is lay out around the section. And so to do that, I simply hold it on here. And then if you kind of close one eye and then kind of rubberneck left and right, you finally get in to where you can view right through the cleft generated by that shoulder and the first bead. First element, first bead in this case. And then a square, and you mark this only on one face. If you mark it on several faces and try and chase it around all four, you'll wind up with it seems like you never ever wind up where you started. And so what that does when you turn the lathe on then is you wind up looking at this, this pencil mark that's about this wide rather than being a nice little accurate piece. I'm sorry, do it again, sir. You put the pencil mark just across one face. Yes, at the bottom of that V where the shoulder ends, and in this case, that first bead starts. Yes, exactly. So I'm going to demonstrate, this kind of a tickly situation for some people. After you do it for a few years, well, you get a little better at it, I guess. But doing that pommel, the square shoulder. There are several names for that element in a turning. I set my tool rest here, a fat 1/8 of an inch off. You always give it a test run there. But the thing you do is you look at, again, if you're off axis with it over here looking at it or off axis here, sooner or later you line up and bingo, there's your line right there. And so there are several ways to make this. And at the traditional way to do it, all your old English turners and French turners, they all do this with a skew. And I think everybody got excited about using the skew because this is a really easy tool to sharpen, right? You sharpen it just like you do a kitchen knife, essentially, from two sides. But the game here, the real critical thing here is that you have to do this job only with the point. If you engage the edge, you'll have a problem, okay? So once again, I'm going to make this shoulder out here somewhere as a practice cut to demonstrate this. But we're going to use what's called the long point, okay? And we're going to make a little incision there. And all that does is score the fibers. And then again, you keep the tool straight up and down. If you lean it over one way or the other, you'll engage in the edge. All right? And so to the right side and to the left side, you just push the tool straight in. And so you see that what I'm developing there is a V notch, right? And that notch is very similar to the shape that you've sharpened your tool to, right? So it's following one edge here and the other edge over here alternately. If you want to get a square shoulder, which we have to do, is then you have to get that edge perpendicular to the axis of your turning. And so instead of going in straight here, you have to swing one side out and go in. And the V notch that you created there is just a place for chips to go. You have to provide a place for the chips to go. You know, you've used an axe perhaps, and you can only pound an axe into a tree so far because there's no place for the wood to go. So you chop above and then you chop below and pull out a chip. It's kind of the same situation here. Does this make sense? Everybody nodding their head? Nobody bored just yet? So that's one way to make that shoulder. Here's a 1/2 inch spindle gouge. You can do the same thing, okay? And again, when you enter a turning, whether it's it's this intermittent cut like you have on the square section here, or whether it's on a round spindle, is you simply lay the tool on here and raise the handle. And you have to have the flute set in vertical position, 6 and 12, okay? If you have it laid over like this, it'll spiral over one way, okay? So again, we're going to make an incision there this way. We're going to cut from left and right. And at this point, we don't have a big enough gouge or big enough hollow here, but you go from being vertical when you initiate this cut to the flute being nearly horizontal at the bottom of the cut. And each one of these times you'll see the danger here is that you get blowout on the far side of the cut. You can see here, this is very clean. All right? Oop, excuse me. So, down to business here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to establish the first part of this. And again, I have to get the back side of the bevel. If I want a square shoulder, I have to get the back side of the bevel perpendicular to the spindle axis. So there you are, no blowout on it at all. So that's how you do a pommel, a shoulder. This is a big spindle, long spindle. We'll try and use this big rough out gouge. Whenever you use a rough out gouge, you start out by rubbing the bevel against the points of the square that are coming around and raise the handle. You pivot on the tool rest and raise the handle. Okay, I got a chip. And I run down the length of it. I raise the handle a little more and I run back again. You have to be careful over here. There we go. As you advance into this area here, whether it's square or round, if you have it set up to where you get a chip off this leading edge over here, and it will be a leading edge here, it'll be a leading edge down here as well. Over here, it'll be a leading edge. And so as you get there, you want to kind of swing the tool out of play with that shoulder that's developed there, or else it'll flip it up at you and you'll swear at it, okay? So I'm going to button my shirt up here. I find I get fewer chips down my shorts that way. That's magic. Now, what we're trying to do here is get a cylinder. I was just explaining to, is it Fred? Kirk? Joe. Joe, if you want to make a cylinder, and that's what we want to do here, you simply set the rest up, the front edge of the rest up, parallel with the ways. And you can do that by simply sighting over it. And that did a pretty good job, actually. Anyway, and then you basically have an edge that's parallel with the axis of your lathe. Again, to start, always start by rubbing a bevel, raise the handle, run with it. Now, these big gouges are nice because the other way to do this job is to do it with that skew. And you'll find purists that'll say, "Oh no, you can't do that with a gouge. You need to do that with a skew." But the fact is, there's only part of this tool that's round or has a radius on it. The two lips over here, the last, I don't know, maybe a fat quarter of an inch, are absolutely straight. Okay, and it has to do with how they're manufactured. But if you'll roll the tool over all the way over, can you see that? You roll the tool all the way over there to that flat part. That's exactly what you do with a skew. You can run it either way, do a climb cut, either way. Now, we're not looking to do, this is the initial part of this. And what I tell people is there's really no reason for this to be all that smooth, except that this is where you practice, right? You practice all your moves when it doesn't count. And that way, when it comes to where you want to count, then you can do them. So I'm going to get the rest of this shoulder figured out with a parting tool. I'm going to run right up to it with the outer chine on the parting tool. Bring that into play right there. And you can run laterally with this tool a little bit. And so that's now round. So what we're trying to do is to create two square shoulders here, and then we'll go back to figuring out how to do the rest of it. Again, looking past the edge of the rest to the gap in the ways, And you'll find that you can run that up pretty much parallel.
You can move the camera.
Here's something else that you do when you're doing a rough out, is when you're making a run, you can kind of keep the tool set where it is, but eventually you have to rotate it. If you find yourself getting in the habit of just using it the same way every time, that portion of the tool will get dull, and you'll think, oh, hell, I got to go sharpen the whole thing now. But what you want to do is kind of wear the edge down all at the same time. Like getting a little buzz off of it. And so a hand set on there is kind of like a steady rest. You need to be kind of reluctant to use this part back here on steady rest. It's kind of uncomfortable. There we go. Back here to address this pommel.
The camber position needs to be changed so you have the work in view.
So if you bring the handle up past center, you can get a right angle corner on there with a gouge. Doesn't seem like that'll be possible, but there it is. So the next step in the process is to put the blank that you're working with back up, and you want to check. Make sure that the pommel that you've created here goes ahead and lines up. And the next thing you need to do is figure out whether you've got this pommel set right. And it looks like I'm a little bit shy. So we'll remove a little bit there. I had a pencil. There it is. So another way to do this to make sure you've got it right is to go ahead and superimpose a square on the old spindle and bring it and line it up here, and then draw the line down here. So I'm off maybe a fat 1/16 of an inch. Go ahead and address that. And that'll be fine. Are there any questions so far? Yes, sir. This poplar, yellow poplar. The spindle itself is white oak. That he said, oh, we're just going to make these paint grapes. So poplars are really good wood for that. So the next thing you do then, once you've got those pommels set, the shoulders, you might say, is to go through and mark where the critical transitions and elements are. So some of these you can skip almost, because they'll kind of generate themselves once you get going with it. But again, close one eye, kind of run left and right, and apply a pencil line there. I'm going to stop one right here at the end of this, at that fillet. This, I'm going to count this whole thing right here as one element. And I'm going to mark where this tiny, tiny fillet is. So if I go this way, I'm looking at the surface of this, okay? And if I run too far over this way, then that line starts to get curved. And so you come over here back and forth and the whole thing lines up. And you make a mark. And I'm going to make a mark on either side of this little bead here. And so here's the other side of that bead. And we're going to keep it clamped tight. This is a real common element. It's a bead with a fillet and then about a half cove there. Okay. I'm going to leave this here so I know what I'm doing. The next item here is to run those lines all the way around the spindle. So on almost all spindles, if you do the preparation for your stock properly and you center up properly on the stock that you've made, there will be several elements on the turning, that will already be there. There's no reason to set a caliper for them. But that's the next step then would be, so in this case, this bead will be the major diameter that you can get out of this spindle. This will be the major diameter. This will be the major diameter. This will probably be the major diameter. It might be a little bit less, but this certainly will be. And you'll find a lot too that there'll be a flat sometimes on that initial piece, or it'll be a little off center and so forth. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to guess that these two elements, this fillet and this tiny little half bead, will be the same diameter. And it looks like it's about 1/8 of an inch less. But I can still use this and just make it 1/8 of an inch less. And that way I'm not juggling 8 or 10 of these up and down the lathe. I'm going to set another one for here. And I'm going to count on this being very, very close to the diameter of the next bead there as well. I've done a lot of these and you'll get, yeah, that's right on the money. So essentially what we're going to start with when we do this element is a little bitty cylinder in between those two, right? And then we'll remove material to make the cove and so forth and so on. But that gets me, instead of having to set a caliper here, set a caliper here. And sometimes, whoop, that's a little bit bigger there. So a word on using calipers, you're going to see me using today while the lathe's turning and while I've got a parting tool in one hand and a caliper in the other hand. It's important that the tips of the caliper be kind of polished and rounded, okay? If you get them from the factory and they're squared off or sharp, you'll find them that they'll dig into the wood and flip them back in your face. And I really don't like to handle them when they're on the lathe with the stem pointing at me. It looks like it's kind of an issue. And so I always wind up leaving it that way. And you always want to put a little bit more pressure on this side of the caliper, the side that's closest to you. If you put it on the other side, it'll flip out, right, go in your face. So both of those things are inconvenient at best. So I'm going to raise my tool rest up a little bit. And this, yeah, I can't believe you did that. Give me that thing before you hurt yourself. Are there any questions up to now? You guys surely know exactly what's going to happen now, right? You had a question? Uh-huh. Yeah, certainly could have. Yeah. Right. So we put a rubber band on it, or a clip. Good idea. I doubt it. The next thing that's most critical then is to keep you from having to rubberneck this whole thing again, is to go ahead and transfer those lines. Do I have a pencil here, or did I put it back here again? You transfer these lines onto a story stick. And you may need to put a few more on here. But I always make a break line all the way across. This is all just gonna, there's nothing really here to caliper. But you make a break line there, and you might even want to put an arrow that says, oh, well, this is the bottom and top, or, right? So this goes to the top. And that way you don't get them mixed up. So the next thing to do is to take and make small notches where each one of those little marks is. And that mark, or that notch, will cradle the pencil for you. So did I mention that I have a job to do 48 of these? And if you have more than I don't know, 6 or 8 of them, it gets to be tiresome to use a pencil. And so what I'll do is I'll take each one of these little clefts and I'll put a little finishing nail in it. And I'll super glue that in there. And then when the lathe is running, I just bring it up here, zing it up against there, and there are my marks. Questions? Comments? Insults? Okay. So I do a lot of work. So the next thing, it's very difficult to create this first bead with the shoulders in the way here, right? It can be done on a lot of pieces. But if you have an opportunity here where the shoulder is rounded, then by all means, go ahead and round that shoulder off, and that'll give you a little breathing room there. But when you mark that shoulder off, again, mark it off on only one side. And I'm going to make a mark right here where that curve starts. And it's going to go right into here. And it's going to look about like that. If you make it over here, you'll just get confused because you're looking always on the far side. Right here, you've got chips and tool in the way of the actual form that's developing. But over here, you have the results of what you're doing. That makes sense, everybody? Okay. So I have to have, again, the tool rest, because I'm working briefly with that square edge. I have to leave it out this far away from the spindle. Okay, so you can probably see the line down here, perhaps.
Camera,
I
damn
can
it.
see the line here. And again, we're just going to get it out of the way. And you approach this just like you do a regular spindle. It just happens to be an intermittent cut. So there's a curved pommel, right? It was square and now it's not. Now, one of the things that I've taught myself, I am completely self-taught, is you can do this V notch here. You can do that with a skew. I'll show you how to do it, no problem. But what I found out is the parting tool is a remarkably versatile tool if you use it for things other than making just parting tool cuts. In fact, when you sharpen it, you have the radius of your grinder here, and you flip it over, and you have that same radius here, and the point that runs across the top of the tool here, is that all showing up? All right, so there's a chine here and one on the other side, and those are there because that makes the effective cut material that's being removed is wider than the rest of the tool. And so you have clearance. And so it's imperative that that chine runs here across the edge and down the other side. You can't have it twisted. You can't have it banked off top or bottom of it one way or the other. But through the act of sharpening it, and what you're looking for mostly is to get this tip sharpened, you actually sharpen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the one you're looking at, and you have 2 points. They look exactly like a skew, right? So I'm going to show you how to do this. This is done. The incision here, this first V notch, is done with the tool at a negative rake, a high angle of negative rake. And we're going to work on, it started chattering at me because it's going in resting on the chine, which means that both sides of the tool are cutting, right? If you lay it over to one side, then only one side cuts, right? You lay it the other way and the other side cuts. In this case, this is going to be pretty jumpy. I'm going to do a lot of this kind of steadying. That's probably going to get in the way of the cut, maybe. Yeah, it sure will. Maybe does that help? A little bit. But you can see that by running around here with my hand against the spindle, I can quell that vibration. And then by rotating this thing left or right, I can get one side to cut or the other. Now, I made a mention too that it's kind of like being a skew. And so here we go with, say, the long point of a real tiny skew. And so far, I've been able to do all of this without changing tools. And it maybe isn't so important for a demonstration on a Sunday afternoon, but when you're doing 48 pieces, all that adds up. So the first fillet, that's what those little square pieces are called. Parting tool is not a scraping tool most of the time when you're doing parting cuts. It should be up here almost tangent. Again, rub a bevel and raise the handle till you get a cut. And then the tool path, as it goes into the center, if you were going to, you know, do the unlikely thing to run it all the way to the very center, is it starts high like this and then dives into the center. So again, the spike, the stem off to one side there, the other side of you. And then if it starts to chatter at you, like this one will at some point here in the future, is if you rotate the tool, if you take at it like this, you're taking the full width of cut off of there. If you take and tilt it this way and that way very slightly, you'll find out, and pay attention to where the chips come off of the tool. If you pay attention to that, you'll know where it's cutting, and you can cut off of one side or the other, and you don't have to swing it left or right. All you have to do is just kind of tilt it a little bit. So here's the tool, there's a caliper, and all I'm doing here is going to try and roll this. Can you see the chips coming off there? A little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. Okay, it passes. Still making a little racket. And keep in mind that this goes quickly because when you use a lathe, you're removing material off of a radius, but it's taking material off of a diameter. So it comes off pretty quickly. I'm doing these things just slowly here to make a demonstration out of this. So again, here's this tool working as a scraper on the side here. You got that big beefy angle. Here we go again, doing a little bit of a scrape here, and we're forming a bead there. What's the next element we were going to work with? Okay, so that's this element. Is that right? That's this one. That's right. All right, so this is the one we said was that diameter, but just a little bit less. Drops over and a little bit less. And then this, yeah, so this is our little bead right here. And this is where all this other jive happens. So this little fuzz that develops here, if you're concerned about that, you can get rid of it by taking the tool up here again with one of the points and remove that. Here it's going to start talking to us. And again, you can bounce at it a little bit. If you stick with it, it'll just vibrate your teeth out. And you'll wish that it hadn't. All right, and I figured that one was the same diameter up there. So what I'm going to do is go to the upper end of that. There you go. So what we calipered there is the bottom end of that cove. And that generated the bead there as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and lay this parting tool up against here. And I'm going to say that that bead is the width of my parting tool and about a half. And so I'm going to take a half of a parting tool cut there. And that defines left and right. And then once I have that shoulder, I'm going to go ahead and define, there's a real fine fillet right there. You see that element? I'm not going to caliper it because when we make the bead, it'll become evident. And here's the other side of the bead. I'm just going to reserve it off a little bit. And there's no good way to caliper the bottom of that bead. And that goes into doing a lot for what spindles are all about. They have to look right. Nobody goes up to a staircase in a grand house and looks up and says, oh, I think that spindle's a little bit less or different than that one or that one or that one. You go in and you open the front door and there's this, you know, Beauregards out there in the front. You know, he says, why, look at the staircase. Doesn't say look at the spindles in the staircase. So they have to be close. They don't have to be right. My spinning wheel that I made when I was, I don't know, 16 years old, there were elements on there that are parts of a machine and they have to be right. And it's important that you know the difference. So these little beads, you have to be pretty careful with them because they just disappear with an errant stroke here and there. I have a little bit, what is that, a 1/4 inch?
Yeah, we'll go with that.
1/4 inch gouge. So in this case, we're going to get rid of this. And remember what we did there is we calipered that chine right there. It comes up to a knife edge there, or at least that's what it looks like it does. And so again, we're cutting a cove here. The flute is sitting at 6 and 12, albeit this is a small one. And you raise the handle and you get stuff out of the way. Okay, so there's half of that lip. And here, we're going to make a really, really slim fillet. That's what that's called. And we're going to say that that's pretty good. We might be. Is this interesting? Am I explaining things properly? I'm getting results, of course. I'm sorry. I don't know. You know, it's probably not. It's probably made in Europe. Yeah, it's probably a 3, 4, 5 millimeters, something like that. Yeah, it's a detail gouge. I don't know. Let me send it out to you here in a minute. Now what? For crying out loud, some people. Okay, where were we before we were so rudely interrupted? So it's important to look at, you know, in some spindles, you'll have a cove. Most of the time it's symmetrical. It has a radius at the bottom of a cut. It's imperative to do it properly that it initiate being perpendicular to the spindle. If you have it come in just kind of slop its way in, I guess you might say, it doesn't have all the definition that it might have. If you start with even just the slightest amount of that cove being perpendicular, they'll snap. They'll really have a visual pop to them. I'm using this little bitty gouge here because it produces very little thrust against the workpiece. And so you'll notice that even unsupported, I'm not getting any kind of chatter or howl out of this thing. So we have to leave that little mark there because the next element up is a notch or a V groove. It's imperative that you keep the edge out of the work here. You're working only with that tiny little point. So we all know what I started to say about the hollow, what do you call it, a bead and a cove, is that most of them will be symmetrical. But you'll find, if you do any of this, that some of them are elliptical. And again, it's all about paying attention. When we get ready to do this run along here, this is a positive part right here. But does it run straight from major diameter to minor diameter? Does it run straight? Is it a curve? When does the curve start? You know, does it start and then come up? You know, is it a big broad cove? Those are all elements that you will be able to tell that aren't right in a stairway. So in this case, you see this is a little fat down here. And that curve is a very, very broad radius there. Not straight. And so we're going to work off some material here. You always turn from a large diameter to a small diameter on a spindle like this. The problem with using a real small radius gouge is you wind up with a kind of a rough surface that has a lot of little grooves that spiral around on it. And so what we're going to do here, you say, oh, well, I'll just sand that. But if you use your tool properly and keep them good and sharp, you can scrape that, or you can also use it here with a tool that's nice and sharp and run down the length of it. And you'll notice I don't talk too much here. Whoop, hello. We're going to score the fibers here and create a tiny little fillet there, which is in the spindle. I'm gonna work on this a little bit more. This is a ditzy little piece of work here. A lot of funny little detail. Reestablish that fillet. Kind of bumped it a little bit. There's a fillet at the base of that bead. You know, look carefully at that too. The sides of that bead come up like this. They don't come up straight. They come up and then they form a radius, and it makes that bead look smaller than it is. And so I'm going to take those sides and run them out a little bit. And then there's a little bitty cove there that's too small for my little 1/4-inch gouge. And so what I have is a piece that I made out of an actual metal lathe bit, and just crammed it into the end of a hole here. And I'm just going to scrape that element. When you do shaped cutters like this, you make them one time. And then to sharpen them, you don't go back and rerun the profile. What you do is face grind them exactly the way that they sharpen router bits. Does that make sense? You know what I'm talking about? So instead of, when this needs to be sharpened, instead of running around the profile here with your grinder or something or other, you actually turn this thing over and run this face against the grinder, right? When you have a router bit that has an OG profile on it, they don't regrind that OG profile when they tell you, when you take it out, have it sharpened, you face grind the whole face of that. So this is kind of touchy work here, I tell you what. So again, I'm just looking at this and thinking, yeah, I think that cove's about deep enough. I don't, on a small cove like that, that's real narrow, if you try and run a parting tool into the base, the very bottom of that minor diameter of the cove, you'll wind up with a cove that has 2 little square notches in it, right? And that will show up for sure. So, oh, well, it's at 0. Never mind. It's climbing 700, 900, 1200, 1250. I guess that's maxed out on a slow side. Yeah. So there is an additional tiny little fillet right down here. I'm going to score the fibers first, and then come out and create that fillet. That looks pretty good. I like that. So it's helpful, and again, what I said about putting another mark on your story stick. It's helpful to know where the belly, the major diameter, where that happens. Does it happen here? Does it happen here? But to have it happen exactly where it should, and again, sometimes you can look at where it's closest right here. But when the radius gets really big like that, it's kind of tough. I'm going to say it's right there. I don't know. You don't like my head? Fine. Fine. Be that way. Okay, I'm going to line up here and again, transfer that mark to my story stick. And this time, we'll get these things out of the way, and I'm going to move my tool rest in close to the round part of the spindle. And again, I'm going to sight through, and sometimes it's just habit that I sight past the rest and get the tool rest parallel with the axis. So this time I'm going to try using, actually, that's a pretty big one. I'm going to try using a smaller rough out gouge. You might be able to get by with this. The middle of the spindle, right, is really, really the worst part, right? That's where it'll get the most flexibility here, and we've already reduced the diameter to a fraction of what the major diameter was. Yeah? Thanks. So with really, really sharp tools, we're not getting much buzz out of this. But once you do, if you rub a bevel, it just propagates itself. The bevel then acts just like a cam follower. So what I'm going to do here again is stabilize this. So whenever your tool is about to run out of the edge, I'm sure you've seen this even on bowls, where you get right to the edge and then the tool wants to jump off that last little bit right off the corner. And so be mindful of that. One of the things you can do instead of just going ahead and letting it happen is you can kind of just roll the tool and it'll happen very progressively, very controlled manner. Where'd my spindle go? There it is. You hide? Never mind. So again, I want to look critically at that curve. I want to establish where the minor diameter of it is down here at the base of this little bead, and then take a look at it. And it looks like I need to remove a little bit there. And then I'm just going to kind of, I don't know, almost shear scrape it here. And then we're going to move and establish what we've got going on up here at the top of the spindle. And sequence, sometimes on a real whippy spindle, the sequence of cuts that you make become real critical. And the top there has a big bead. And then it has, what do we have? One set up here. And this was set up for the big one, I believe, huh? Yep. And that's the same there. No, it's about a skinny eighth, maybe a fat 16. So again, these things, you can mark them off. And that's a good idea. But when you get to the 40th one, you can pretty well just figure it. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark where the tip of that curve starts. And it's pretty much something like that. A lot of times what you'll find is that the actual cut is straight. Okay, it's probably been done with a skew. But you've seen that string art where you have a whole bunch of nails that are drilled here, you know, put in one axis and the other, and then there's string that drags between the two of them, and you create a curve. It's exactly the same concept here. If this line is straight, it actually generates a curve in that plane. So the tool here is running against that square shoulder. And you rub the bevel on that, but not too hard. Make sure we got the right one there. And I need to come back and make sure where that line is. It is at the top side, the left side of the bead, or the right side of the bead, because that much is going to be critical. So it looks like what it is at the top side of that bead. And so the bead actually takes place to the left, and then there's a small fillet below it. Can you see how the chips come off the left and then the right as I rock this? There we go. And there's another bead up there right below that big one. And that bead is exactly the width of the tool here. And that one's just a little bit fat of it. So here's the left side of that bead. And then there's a fillet. And this fillet is a continuation of this diameter here. This diameter, you could caliper that. I wouldn't blame anybody for calipering that, but I'll bet you this diameter and that diameter are identical. And so I can look at this here, and here's the one diameter we kind of eyeballed for the fillet. The other side goes straight in. One side of that bead is a little longer than the other one. And so I'm going to make a parting tool cut that's a little bit deeper there, and that will help gauge me when I'm making the rest of this here. And again, you look over here. You have to trust that what you're doing with your hands and the tool and so forth are going to work. But the place where the shape develops is over there on the far side. While I've got the parting tool in my hand, we're going to make this bead up here. That bead is followed by another small bead. Yeah, you can run back and forth here a little bit. It'll probably save you a little bit of time. That's too much material. So that little bitty bead up there has a small fillet on the left side of it. I'm describing all this. Is this evident to you what you can see down here? Okay. This a maddening spindle has all this kind of little bitty detail on it. It's just a pain in the butt to work with. You getting all this?
I am
All right.
100%.
Ha! So that's a V notch in between two beads. Small fillet. And it looks like I didn't gauge that minor diameter there quite right. It's a little bit smaller than what I've got described there. So now we're going to create the other side of that fillet. And again, it's just a tiny little damn thing. And it's important to notice that there's a little bit of a taper there. This is not a cylindrical shape here. And it's important to get that shoulder just right. Whoops. The flute sits there at 6 and 12 when you initiate that cut. This diameter should be about the same as that one. So now we have a taper, but it's a little bit curved. And this time what I'm going to do, instead of setting up parallel with the ways, I'm going to set up more or less parallel with a line that would describe the major and minor diameters here. You don't have to get it just right, but the way you do it is you kind of sneak up on it. You make that curve a little bit bowed outward, and you work on this side a little bit, and you come to a line kind of a point, and you work on this side and come to a point, and then you blend in between the two. So again, I'm going to try working with this to work off a lot of material here. I have to have my hand here. So this part of the spindle comes out as a positive shape and then sweeps into a negative, into a curve, into an inward curve. This much here is pretty much cylindrical. There's a little bit of a taper before you get to that cylinder. So we're going to be actually, the minor diameter is down here somewhere. And this is all just generated, just what I'm telling you is what I see. And it's important to have this kind of critical look at things. So I'm going to remove a little material here. And that actually is going to be where we're going to stop this. So again, you see that in through here, I've got material to remove, considerable amount of it. A little slower traverse here will give a better surface quality. We still need to take a little out of here, I believe. And this is where this sweep starts, right? And so if you take here and just stay, you'll run a taper, right? Run a taper. But if you start here, and then as you traverse, if you swing the handle in, you'll generate that really nice, real subtle curve there. And again, just a fundamental thing about turners is, you notice I'm not out here doing this. Yeah, I've got the handle here tucked against my side, and I'm working at it and swaying with it, shifting my weight from left to right. Okay, one last look at things. That's not too bad. Maybe a little off here. Now, I know I banged that one bead up there pretty hard at one point, an errant run with a tool. Yeah, well, we may be able to fix that. And we might not be able to fix it. That's not too bad. So what's left to do is to sand it. I think that's not quite thin enough there. I thought so. Looked a little stocky. It's just a matter of a tool path there that works and that I don't have to change it. You can go either way. It's always, traditionally going downhill, going from large to small diameter is the way it's always been done. You're working with the grain at that point. But this is also a climb cut coming up this way. So the chip starts out really, really thin, nothing in fact, and gets fatter. Whereas if you come at it this way, the chip is big and tapers off, and it generates different thrust qualities against it. So in this case, you see how this thing wiggles here, right? So if I put this tool up here without a hand on it, this thing jump out of between centers, potentially. So the only thing left to do is to sand it. This is a paint grade unit piece, and so I typically stop at 120 grit with really sharp tools. You might even be able to start finer than that. But paint grade, if you burn it down too fine, then paint won't stick to it very much. But you got to get it down to a critical amount where the sanding lines don't show through the first coat of paint. So when you do this, it's imperative, and it's really important in this particular spindle because you have all this minute little detail, these tiny little coves, and these sharp transitions between them. And if you just go over this thing, willy-nilly, you'll kill all that detail. And so it's important that you sand very carefully. And you see here where I'm working up to the bottom of that V there. And you see where it's not quite smooth right in there. But that got it. And here we're going to excuse me, sand this bead. And again, we have to maintain that little fillet there. And the cove, I'm going to bend the sandpaper into something that approximates that cove. And again, here, keep the sandpaper moving. And there's another thing about sanding is a lot of people tell you, oh, you ought to run your speed up really high when you sand. And if you do that, you'll wind up with sandpaper that gets burned pretty quickly. You wear it out. If you reduce the speed a little bit, it'll sand about as quickly, and you won't burn through as much sandpaper. Another word about sandpaper, when you use it, you'll see that I've got this quarter of a sheet. I've got a quarter of a sheet folded into thirds. If you fold it into halves and then fold it once again, you have grit against grit, and they'll fight with each other, and you will not be the winner. So again, here's this little half cove here, and these are tiny little things, and so getting a good radius on there is difficult, but once again, you don't want to ruin your nice work and round off the corners of that. This is where you can lay it on here. Again, don't ruin the corner on that fillet. If you have a little bit of waviness to this, if you take the sandpaper, several thicknesses, and bend it around the spindle, the fact is it'll describe a straight line, and you can sand out some kind of imperfections in the spindle itself. Not too bad. Back up here, being careful not to ruin the detail. In this case, I always like working with a bent face in the sandpaper rather than a single layer. Watch your knuckles. All right. If there's anything unforeseen here, I'm going to call it done. I know. You here.
Obviously, you said this is a fairly detailed spindle, and if you are knocking out 40 or 45 of them, how much time would you ideally spend on each one? Just the turning side of it, not the prep and the joining and planing, all that. But what would you say is an ideal time that you would spend on that spindle?
You see the difference here?
Pardon?
You see the difference here between these two spindles?
I can't see from here. No.
Okay, you can't. Well, here, I'll tell you what. I'll pass these around. Just, I know that you all didn't make out a lot of the real fine detail on there. The smaller one of the two, okay? It's a little bit smaller in dimension. I'm certain if you look at that, you can discern that that's a machine-made spindle, all right? It's not that old. The other one probably is out of 1900, 1920 at the most. And it has the hand of somebody who turned it by hand, okay? And so the difference there in how fine the detail, how well it's executed, and how well it's defined, and just the nature of the elements are not, you see the shoulders, and particularly the shoulder up at the top of that smaller spindle is just kind of mousy. There's not real good definition to it. So all of that to say that the smaller of those two spindles is pretty quick. I can probably get, once I get rolling on those, if I had more than 3 to do, I could probably easily do 4 of those in an hour. And that's not the prep work. This other one here, again, if I had more than 3 to do, I could probably have that done in 3 of them in an hour. Okay. So, and if I get better than that, that's all the better.
So if you're doing a production run on those, what do you charge you for each one of them?
I charge for a paint grade spindle about, 32, 36 inches long, about $70 a piece. If somebody else wants to supply the material, we'll take off, I don't know. There's no more than about 1 board foot in each one of those. So material cost, while it's not insignificant, it's not, it's not going to bite anybody too hard. But the difference between a paint grade spindle made out of poplar and one made out of walnut, yeah, that's maybe you ought to take note of.
Would one of those silhouette tools with little wires help you to check your work afterwards? Or have you ever used that?
I've never used one. I have not. And the other thing, people ask me, well, have you ever used a duplicator? And the fact is that the duplicator that I can afford won't do a nice job. It will not make that spindle. End of story. It'll rough that spindle out, and I can rough out however many of them I need to do. Let's just say 10. But then I have to take it out of the lathe and do all 10 of them. And then I have to put them all back in the lathe, clean them up. Well, hell, in that time, I can go ahead and turn it start to finish. So I think there are certainly more sophisticated duplicating tools, but they get in the game at about 30 grand. And if you've got a $30,000 piece of equipment, you damn well better have it running 24/7. So, anybody else? I'll just pass this one around too. You can kind of compare them. Now again, you guys are going to put the big eye on here, but keep in mind that if you put that next to 100 of its closest friends, they're pretty close. They're close enough, in fact. So the fact that that gets painted, a lot of that little bitty tiny detail that I put on there, that is on the original oak spindle. If you put white latex enamel on there, you'll never see it. It just, what paint does. And if you get a 3rd or 4th or 5th coat on it, sometimes I get spindles that are pulled out of a stairway that's been painted. And you don't even know there's detail there that's there because it's had 4, 5, 6, 8 coats of paint. And the best way to get that off, in fact, if you have that situation, is you take a light hammer and just peck at it, right? Pound at it a little bit. You don't want to point. You want it just like a flat surface, maybe a slightly domed surface, and pound on it, and then you'll find that the whole thing will turn loose. So, you had a question. I mean, if you'll notice when I was turning those, and I used little bitty ones. Yeah, that's actually a little bit of a catch there that I had. And again, you have to pay as much attention to withdrawing from the work with the tools as you do with entering the work. All right, and that's the result of what happened, that one little half bead down there at the bottom. But that parting tool that I use real extensively for the little bitty tiny work like that is always used at a negative angle. And by using it at a negative angle, you wipe fibers back onto wood. The stuff that's coming off of there and what remains is getting wiped, instead of being plucked out onto air, it actually gets mashed back on the material, and you'll find a whole lot more success that way. Sure. Sugar maple's delightful to turn. Yeah. I just finished, what was it I had? I had Oh, they were really interesting. They were 1880s, 1890s spindle, and they were all out of, and that era, they're either out of oak, nice white oak, or they're out of walnut. And you get earlier than that, and they're almost all out of walnut. But these were out of curly maple. They were just exquisite. I mean, the one that I got was just amazing. And I went ahead and I got some. I couldn't find, I could have called off to Groff and Groff or whoever up in the Northeast or out in California and got curly maple, or maybe I could have gotten, the damn blank would have cost me $40 and then shipping on top of that. So we did it out of hard maple. I got 8/4 and took it down a little. It was like 1 3/4 inch and a little less maybe. But there were part of that board that had a little bit of figure in it. So it was a really good compromise. So any other questions? Comments, insults? So I have another spindle you can play around with if you want, or send y'all. What time is it? Oh, 3 o'clock, 3:30. Tom tells me I have to stay here till 4. So I brought along a big piece, big chunk to work with, and this was so tiny, the infinitesimal detail on this. In fact, I didn't even have a job to turn for you all today until about Thursday or Friday of last week. And so when this guy calls me up and says, "Hey, I got a couple of spindles," and it's like, yes. So I didn't get to choose what I wanted to do there, but I've got another piece here we can chuck up, and I can demonstrate just again how to do coves and beads, tapers and whatnot. Is there a different? I'm sorry, I need to turn this off. All right, technical guys. Oh, there it is. So I had this piece on for another demonstration for our friends down south in Jeff County, down in God's country. And so you can see it's a little bit out of round. Yeah, it's a little out of round. What's going on? Do you have any idea what's going on here? Oh, there it is right there. That's better. Okay. I'm going to make a truing up cut here, but suffice it to say, when I enter this cut, let's turn this thing way down. These are real critical things here that are important to demonstrate properly. And sometimes it works well to do this at a fairly slow speed, as in real slow. So some of you, perhaps even on bowls, you'll come in here and you'll enter this cut with this thing sitting here not at 6 and 12. And what'll happen is it'll spiral off, only it'll happen a whole lot faster. If you get a catch like that and you turn the lathe off and you put the tool right back in the tool path, you'll see exactly what happened. What you did is you entered the piece of work with the edge here. It's imperative that you pay attention to what edge is entering the work first. And if it's angled like that, then it will go ahead and spiral off exactly like that. However, if you use the nose of the tool, and the nose of the tool is vertical, as in you've got the flute turned here to 6 and 12, then it'll sit there all day long and not move. What'd you do now? Okay, I see what you did. Right? 6 and 12, not quite vertical. There it is. Right? It's imperative that you understand that, because at this point where you're entering the cut or widening out a cove like this, there's nothing to rub a bevel on. And so to that end, you have to enter the cut with a vertical edge. And the same way when you enter this cut here, and you're going to say, oh, well, hell, the part down here is at an angle, but that's not the part that's entering the wood. It's the very nose up here that's entering the wood. So if I get no more than just a mark like you see here, I now have control on the cut and I can rotate it, right? Or push against it and go in. So here we go. Again, this time when I'm just modifying this, I can come over here and I can feel it. I don't have to have it perpendicular here or set at 6 and 12. All I have to do is come up over here and feel it, much the same way that if you were going to make a cut here, you'd feel it, feel the material with the heel of the bevel and raise the handle. Same thing here, only it's more or less horizontal. And you watch for a chip to develop. Whoop, hello. Watch for a chip to develop, and then more or less push. Okay? And as you approach the bottom of the curve, then you go ahead and rotate and open the gouge up. You see how that went? It's exactly the same kind of thing you do when you're bowl turning as well. You enter the cut with it being vertical. In this case, I'm going to stand over here. Whoop, hello. Yeah? And again, you see how that's kind of wonky. What are you guys? You can't really make it out. But you see here, this isn't quite round, and it ought to be. And what we're doing here is watching over here. If you watch here, you get all confused with chips and tools and so forth and so on. Yeah, much better, right? So the purpose of fillets, those little shoulders, is to define differences between elements. If you don't have fillets in the work of a spindle, I had an instructor in college, and he was trying to explain this. He says, it just looks like squeezed dough. It's like somebody just took some dough and squeezed it. And all you have is this kind of undulating surface. But it's those fillets that actually define, here's where it stops, here's where it starts, and so forth. But here's a big bead, and you end this bead perpendicular to the stem again. And in this case, we're going to come right up to it here. And if you'll study where the chips are coming off here, that's a cut that a skew makes. But by using the tool in this fashion, as a production turner, I have to go over here and get another tool. All right. Again, line up the tool rest with the ways. And I simply pinch off the tool and run it. They make a nice little finger groove right underneath of the edge. Raise the tool up a little bit, make another pass, raise the tool up, rotate the gouge. You got a nice big one like this, and work the whole surface down, the whole edge. You can run at it square on like what I'm doing here. You can also back cut it this way. You can angle into it a little bit as well. But the nice thing about this tool, since it's square cut across the front of it, is you can cut anywhere along here. You don't have to change the edge at all. Don't change the angle. It's the same cut because the profile is not rounded. You got something to say?
I found out that we have to depart by 4, so I wanted
All
to
right.
thank you where you're at. But everyone give a round of applause for Paul tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, and I'm glad you got some work so you could demonstrate. I was really,
That's kind of handy.
all right. Well, thank you very much. Questions? Check the door prizes. I forgot. If your name or their speech password, Charlie will be back there to tell you how to do Rosetta Stone.
Go ahead.
Brother's got stairs over his house. Well, when you go down the stairs, people grab a hold of one of the spindles and they're broken.
Yeah.
Okay, so how can I measure that without taking it out?
How can?
It's cracked, but it's not broken.
Oh, I see. You might be best if you let me turn this off.